So if you've entered the US illegally, and now you have a program, you have some sort of provisional status like temporary protected status or DACA, deferred action for childhood arrivals, or you might even have a pending affirmative asylum application. You might qualify for parole. If you've watched my other videos, then you know I make a really big deal of the inspection requirement for applying for a green card in the US. If you don't know what I mean by that, I'm gonna give you a quick primer on the basics of applying for permanent residence before I explain one other option that you may not have considered. So let's say you want to file a family petition for a spouse who entered the US with a visa. The fact that your spouse entered the US legally with a visa is one of the most important parts of the case. If she entered through the border without inspection, without seeing an immigration officer, then there is no way to apply for adjustment of status in the US through your family petition unless you qualify for one of the various exceptions that I talked about in another video. I'll post to that video at the end of this, but I want to briefly go through what those exceptions are and suggest one final exception that I didn't mention in that other video. Aside from showing that your spouse entered the US legally and now you want to file a petition for them, there are a couple other ways we can do it. If your spouse entered before 2001, there was a special program in 2001 called 245I. And suffice it to say that if your spouse entered before 2001 or any family member who you want to petition for entered the US before 2001, you should screen to see if they're eligible for section 245I because it'll allow them to apply for permanent residence possibly without leaving the US and without proving that they entered the US with inspection. One of the other ways that you could fix your illegal entry, and I've discussed this ad nauseum in some of my other videos, is through the process of parole. So if you've entered the US illegally, and now you have a program, you have some sort of provisional status like temporary protected status or DACA, deferred action for childhood arrivals, or you might even have a pending affirmative asylum application. You might qualify for parole, which is advanced permission to leave the US and re-enter for a specific purpose. Usually you need to show a serious reason why you need to leave. For example, a family member is dying or on their deathbed, or there's some sort of irreparable harm that you will suffer if you're not able to leave the US for this limited purpose. When you re-enter the US with your parole document, you have now fixed your previous illegal entry, and you might be able to apply for a green card through a specific family member. And there are different variations of parole. For example, if you have a family member, a very close family member, typically a spouse or a child who's in the military, you might qualify for military parole in place. For example, let's say you entered illegally, but your son, who's now 19 years old, is in the army. You can apply for military parole in place and fix your illegal entry without actually ever leaving the US and re-entering legally. And now if you also have a US citizen spouse, you can use that spouse to apply for your green card by fixing your illegal entry through your military family member. What I want to discuss today that I've never discussed in a previous video is referred to as a Quilantan entry. This is when someone enters through the border, either Mexico or Canada, and they never had a visa, and they never lied to an immigration officer, but they physically saw an immigration officer and they were waived through. I have two cases like this right now. One of them was for a child who entered in the backseat of a car who never talked to immigration officers. They drove through the border. He was with some distant relatives like an aunt and an uncle who did have legal status. And he was 8 years old. He just sat in the back of the car and they drove through. The immigration officer never asked for his documents and never talked to him. He never specifically engaged in fraud, and he actually qualifies as being inspected. So now, fast forward 20 years, he has a US citizen spouse. And we want to show that he entered the US with inspection so that he doesn't need to leave the US to apply for permanent residence outside of the US. Because if you recall, the only way that someone in this situation can apply for a green card from within the US is if they show that they've been inspected. So now if we can prove that he was sitting in the backseat of a car that drove through the Mexico-US border 20 years ago, he can qualify for permanent residence right here without ever leaving. So the question you might be asking or wondering now is, how do you prove that? Well, it can be as simple as preparing a detailed statement from him, an affidavit explaining all of the details and what he remembers. In this case, I've prepared an affidavit, a sworn statement from him and from every adult family member. So in this case, his mom, his dad, and his uncle all had detailed knowledge because they were a part of the process of bringing him into the US. They all have intimate knowledge of what happened, so I prepared detailed statements from all of them. We might also hire a private company to give him a polygraph test so that we can bring the results with us when he eventually attends a USCIS interview. What will happen down the road is he's going to attend an interview and they're going to record him and ask him a million questions about the circumstances of his entry. And if they believe that he actually entered the US through a legal port of entry, even if he didn't have a visa, even if he had no lawful way to enter the US, then he qualifies as having been inspected, and now we can continue with his green card process. Every Quilantan entry case is unique because everybody entered in different ways and there might be different pieces of evidence available to support how you entered. Sometimes we need to write detailed statements. Sometimes we have copies of documents like old passports and visas. Sometimes people entered with somebody else's passport, but they still passed through a legal port of entry, and we might be able to work with that. If you entered the US through a port of entry, even if you don't think you entered legally, the most important thing to do is to speak with an immigration lawyer to see if you can meet the inspection requirements. Because if you can, you might be eligible to apply for a green card, permanent residence in the US, through your qualifying family members. Alright guys, that brings us to the end of today's video. I know this was a bit of a complicated topic. If you have a family member through whom you want to apply for permanent residence, for example, you have a US citizen son or daughter who's over the age of 21, or a US citizen spouse, and you're in the US and you want to know if you qualify for permanent residence, give me a call or book a consultation through my website. I would be more than happy to work with you one-on-one to go through all the circumstances to see if you qualify for permanent residence. If you're new to my channel, be sure to like and subscribe. I do answer all of the comments where people post their various immigration questions for 1 week after each video post. So if you have any questions about any immigration related topic, be sure to post it on my most recent video. I post a video on a weekly basis, so I'll see you guys next week for another one.